Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to be able to spend a little time visiting with you about different ways to, renovate, reseed, kind of reinvigorate your pastures out there. Now, this is a very large topic and a lot of things that we could spend some time discussing. I could spend 3 or 4 hours easily discussing this topic. So I've just kind of tried to boil it down to what I consider to be some of the more important nuggets of information that will hopefully help you, make some improvements to your individual pastures. So first, just like to start off and talk just a few minutes here about, why would you want to even consider maybe renovating or reseeding your pasture? And probably one of the first things that comes to my mind anyway, in most people's minds, is yields, productivity out there. You have some animals and you need to feed those animals, and you probably maybe just don't have enough forage out there to feed those animals. So productivity is probably on the top of the list. Second, there is forage quality. What's the nutritional value of that forage that's being produced out there, and is it meeting the needs of the animals that you're trying to feed? Third on the list, and this really probably applies to a lot of small acreage properties, is weed encroachment. You've maybe lost some of those productive grasses and legumes out there, and you've got weeds like Canada thistle and leafy spurge and maybe some of these different things that have come in and encroached and has crowded out some of those more palatable, nutritious forage species. Palatability, some species animals just won't eat, or they don't really like them, so we want to maybe replace those with some good palatable species like orchard grass or smooth brome or something like that. Lots of bare ground, open to soil erosion. Those are things we see a lot in our pastures around the state. The last one there is compacted soils. You have a lot of animals out there on the pasture when it's wet. We tend to get some soil compaction issues. So we'll talk just a little bit about ways to maybe alleviate that. And I'm sure there's some other things that I haven't thought of that may be on your list. All right, so the techniques we're gonna kind of go through this afternoon are, there's a number of different renovation techniques. The first one I'm going to talk about just briefly is fertilization, and that's something that you may not think about when you think about renovating a pasture, but it's a very important thing to consider. The aerating and ripping. A lot of people, this is one of the first things they want to do is go out and aerate and rip and try to kind of renovate their pasture in that way. And there's some positives and negatives associated with that. The last two we're going to talk about is the interseeding approach or overseeding approach, and I'll define that here in just a little bit, and then just the complete renovation where you go out and you till it up, plow it up, and then completely reseed that. Now, just kind of one caution, and I'll try to make references to both irrigated and dry land conditions. I know everybody's situation is a little different. Some people have irrigation water, some people don't. Some people may have irrigation water for the early part of the season and not later in the season. So these are all things, we live in the West, and dry environment, and water is typically the number one limiting factor when it comes to forage production out there. So the first thing, again, I'll just briefly touch on fertilization. It's often the forage productivity or the amount of forage that's being produced out there, it's related to a lack of fertility. So getting that soil test and knowing what is the nutrients that are available in the soil for plant growth is extremely important. Oftentimes, just adding a little fertilizer, and it's expensive these days, but just adding a little fertilizer will not only increase your yields, but it can actually change the composition of the plants out there. Nitrogen is one of the biggest drivers of plant growth in the system, and it's amazing what a little bit of nitrogen will do to make some plants more competitive and other plants less competitive. Again, you really need that soil test because phosphorus, again, may be limiting in some situations. So that balance of nitrogen and phosphorus is very important, and the only way to really know that is through a soil test. And when we talk about fertilization, this is going to work best when we're working in irrigated conditions. Again, water is our most limiting factor, and under dry land conditions, the water is typically going to be more limiting than any nutrient out there. So if we're talking about an irrigated situation, maybe 40 to 80 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre is what you might want to consider. In dry land, some situations I will recommend a little bit of fertilizer, but not all. But again, it's going to be a very small amount, maybe around 30 pounds per acre. Now, if you look at that graph on the bottom, this just shows you, I want to just kind of illustrate how important nitrogen is in the system. This is from a mountain hay meadow up in the Gunnison area, but it shows meadow foxtail, and this is not the weedy foxtail. This is a planted, improved grass species. The blue bars and the gray bars is where we applied 100 pounds or 200 pounds of nitrogen, and we significantly increased the composition in the hay of the meadow foxtail. Quackgrass, the second grass there, farmers consider that to be a weed, but it's actually a pretty good forage. That species also increased as we added nitrogen back to the system. Kentucky bluegrass, the third set of bars there, that species we actually saw a decrease in. So just again, kind of an illustration of how nitrogen can be used to change the composition of the plants out there, and hopefully lead things more to the composition and the types of plants, the more palatable type plants that you'd like to see in your pasture. Second thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is, I guess, idea of aerating or ripping a pasture. This consists of, there's all different types of pasture renovators, pasture aerators. You can go online and there's all different types and manufacturers out there. But it typically either consists of punching slots or holes into the ground, or ripping slots, continuous slots, a ripper type aerator. Now, I've actually done some research on this, and as well as read a lot of the scientific literature, and there's little hard scientific evidence to say that this management practice works to actually increase your forage production. The one place where you might see some increase in your forage production is on soils that are severely compacted. And I underlined severely there on the slide because, I mean, compacted to the point where water will barely infiltrate into the soil. So the photos there, you can see that yellow airway aerator, that just punches slots in the soil. And then the ripper type aerator, you can kind of see the types of disturbance that makes to the system, to the plants out there. So I said that, there's little hard scientific evidence to say that this works, but there are some potential benefits to consider. Our soils are made up of, the soil, the mineral matter itself. Ideal soil is about 50% soil, about 25% water, and about 25% air. So if those are out of balance, we might be able to improve that through this ripping or aerating procedure. Again, probably the biggest factor that we can influence is to relieve these compacted layers. Again, to improve water infiltration, which leads to more vigorous, deeper root systems that can go deeper into the soil, more drought tolerance, those types of things. The third one is to improve our water management, especially if we're using flood irrigation. The photo there shows a meadow up in the Gunnison area again, where they use flood irrigation. We ripped some slots on the contour of the irrigation ditch. You can see how those slots kind of help to catch and spread that water out, hold it higher up, and keeps it from running into the low spots. So you might be able to see some forage production advantages with improved water management with these techniques. The fourth one there is to relieve sod-bound conditions. This would primarily relate to the ripping type of action. A lot of our rhizomatous grasses, things like smooth brome especially, can get what we call sod-bound. These underground rhizomes or stems become very thick and matted, and if we go in there with some type of a ripper, we can kind of break that up and stimulate new tiller, grass tiller production, and sometimes we can see an increase in forage production from that. These techniques probably can work equally well under both dryland and irrigated conditions. Again, probably better response under irrigated than you would see under dryland. But again, if you have a dryland pasture that's severely compacted, heavy clay soils, again, you might be able to see some advantage. Now, this is a study I did up in the Gunnison area on a couple of mountain hay meadows where we used that airway aerator that punched the slots into the soil, and we did two different ripping actions, one on 12-inch centers and one on 6-inch centers. And if you look at the columns there, two different meadows, and the percent change compared to the undisturbed control, you don't see any positive changes there. We actually decreased our forage yield from about 8-9% up to 32%. So I'm not much of an ag economist, but it doesn't take much of a rocket scientist or economist there to figure out that this is not going to pay for itself. We don't really want to be going backwards. We want to be going forwards. So basically, we disturbed those plants. That ripping action is a fairly severe disturbance. We actually ripped some of the plants out of the ground, and it actually ended up decreasing our overall yield. So again, if you're going to use these techniques, you want to be very careful and try it on a small piece, leave an aerated or ripped piece, and then an undisturbed piece, and then see what your forage yield is. That's the best way to test it on a small scale on your own property, because there's nothing consistent enough out there to say that it works or where it works and where it doesn't work. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about this concept of interseeding or overseeding pastures. Basically just consists of adding new seeds or new plants to a pasture without completely killing what's already out there, those existing plants. It goes by a lot of different names: sod seeding, no-till seeding, frost seeding. There's a whole bunch of different terms that are used to kind of describe this particular technique. So some reasons to maybe consider this interseeding approach. Again, under an irrigated situation, a lot of times we want to add legumes to a grass-dominated field. This can improve both our quantity and the quality of the forage that we're producing out there. Those legumes are very high quality, high in protein, high in digestibility. So a lot of times we like to add legumes to our grasses. You can also add grasses to a thinning stand of alfalfa to prolong the stand life. This is very common. Once alfalfa reaches 5, 6, 7 years of age, the stand it'll start to decline and thin out, prone to weed invasion. But if we can put some grasses in there, we can produce a very nice grass alfalfa hay for our animals. You can also just thicken the declining grass stands. Add grasses back to grasses. Typically, we want to look for bare ground. If there's bare ground out there, we might be able to thicken that stand back up. The fourth one there, we don't practice a whole lot here in the western U.S., but you sometimes can add annual forages like sorghum sudan grass or wheat or triticale, something like that, to our perennial forage stands to improve productivity, extend the grazing season, or extend the stand life of a thin stand. This tends to work a little better in some of the eastern parts of the United States. I've tried it here in the west and some different pastures and hay fields and have not had very good luck with that. So what do you want to look for in pastures that might need reseeding? Again, abundance of weeds, weedy annuals, or perennial broadleaf plants. It's just a good indication that you need to get something in there to compete with those weeds, something that's going to provide a little more forage than the weeds themselves for your animals. Again, production, something that's low producing, a species that may be dominated by such things as like Kentucky bluegrass, dandelions, some of those plants that might be very good nutritionally, but they just don't produce a whole lot. Sparse plant cover, this is probably one of the big ones. Bare ground really needs to be evident when you try this interseeding approach. And then the legumes, again, can't overemphasize the importance of legumes in some of our pasture situations due to their improved quality, protein, and digestibility. So I got some slides, and on some of the slides I say key, and those are the ones that I think are really important. So this first one here is bare ground. Again, for the best establishment success with this interseeding approach, you need to have bare ground evident. Okay, the slide there on the left shows a very good example of a pasture where we have some plants, some good grass plants, but we also have a lot of bare ground showing. The one thing we don't want to forget about is plants compete for 4 major things, and the one that we often forget about is space. Okay, they need a place to put down a home, put down their roots, and to grow. The photo there on the right of a nice thick stand of pasture stand, the interseeding approach is really not going to work there. There's just no space there to get new plants established. So some of the advantages of this interseeding approach we'll talk later here about the complete tillage, the complete renovation, the conventional tillage approach. It's generally more cost effective. There's just fewer trips over the fewer operations, tillage operations and that type of thing involved with the interseeding. We just need a drill typically. We go out and we drill some seed in. We may need a little bit of herbicide to control some weeds. So it's generally a lot more cost effective. You also leave the existing vegetation in place. So you basically have a built-in cover crop. So your erosion potential is minimized. There's going to be less downtime, loss of productivity. You still have those existing plants out there, and you're just trying to have to change your management a little bit to get those new plants established, but you're still going to have some forage out there for your animals with those existing plants. And so typically you're going to have less downtime, again, if everything works correctly. Some of the disadvantages, the risk of failure is going to be higher. Again, you're trying to get new plants established within an existing stand. Those existing plants, are well established, have a well-established root system, so they're going to be able to compete for the water and the nutrients and the light and all those types of things. So a lot of times we'll see, or just the risk of failure is going to be higher compared to completely starting over. The second disadvantage is that these interseeding drills that can effectively seed into the existing vegetation are often difficult to find. They're becoming more and more commonplace, but it depends on your particular area. You may or may not have access to one of these drills. And the third thing, and this is where a lot of people really get frustrated with the interseeding approach, is it can take 2 to 3 years before those interseeded plants achieve full productivity and really start adding to your forage base. So you really have to be patient with this approach. And again, it's going to require really careful management, especially grazing management, to promote those new plants. You probably want to graze it some, but you can't graze it so hard that the animals are actually removing and grazing on those new seedlings as they're trying to become established. So the second key that I have listed here is suppression. That existing vegetation, again, just acts like a weed or anything else. It needs to be suppressed prior to interseeding to improve your establishment success. And there's a number of different ways to do that. The most consistent way is to apply herbicides like glyphosate. There's been a lot of research done in all parts of the United States, and the herbicide suppression typically is the most successful. But some people may or may not like the herbicide approach, may not have the means to apply herbicides, so some of these other means may be more applicable, especially for small acreage people. Heavy grazing with livestock up until time of seeding is a good way to suppress that existing vegetation. You can use some electric fence, concentrate those animals, and basically you're going to overgraze and kind of set those existing plants back. And then you can broadcast seed or drill some seed in there. If you're broadcasting the seed, you can actually use the animals to actually help imprint that seed and get that soil to seed contact that you need. Lots of different mechanical ways to set the vegetation back. You can use a light disting, again, just 1 inch or 2 deep. You don't want to totally take out all the existing plants that are there. You just want to kind of knock them back for a little bit. I've used shallow rototilling, again, about 1 inch deep, just to kind of take the tops of the existing plants off. I really like this flail mowing. Instead of a blade type mower, a flail mower just has a shaft, and it typically has pieces of chain welded to it, and at the end of the chain it just has a chunk of metal, and you can set that down close to the soil surface and again just beat the tops of the existing plants off and then come in and do your seeding, and it typically will give those plants enough time to become, germinate and establish and get a root down before those existing plants come back. So this little chart here just gives an example. Again, this is in a mountain hay meadow where we just directly seeded into the existing vegetation, no suppression or control, and we were seeding birdspit trefoil, which is a legume species. Got about 12% trefoil in the hay. When we did a light rototilling there on the bottom, it was kind of intermediate at about 18%. On the hay was made up of the trefoil. But where we sprayed it with a light rate of Roundup, glyphosate, we got about 24% of the hay composition was made up of the birdspit trefoil. And again, when we're interseeding legumes into these grass stands, that's about where we want to be, about 1/4 of the stand made up of that legume that we're trying to get seeded in there. So just some herbicide suggestions for interseeding. Again, this typically works best in our irrigated pastures and meadows. Roundup or the glyphosate is probably the best one to use. A lot of people are familiar with the Roundup. It is a broad spectrum herbicide, and it's supposed to really kill, grasses, forbs, legumes, all of those types of plants. But if you apply it at lighter rates, we can basically get a burn down of those existing plants, seed those new plants in there, again, giving those new seedlings a chance to get established before those existing plants come back. It's amazing how resilient, especially the grasses are to Roundup. Again, we can burn them back for a period of time, but most of the time they will come back fairly vigorously. The big unknown when you're applying Roundup is, what rate to use. I've used anywhere from 3/4 of a quart to 2 quarts per acre. Again, it just depends on what the existing species are out there. Some of them are very easy to suppress, and some of them it takes a fairly high rate to suppress. In the springtime, you want to let those plants get up about 4 to 6 inches and then apply the Roundup. That works very well. You can also use a fall application after the first hard frost, but the problem with the fall application is often you will kill all these existing plants, because at that point in time there are moving carbohydrates, those sugars, down into that crown and root system, and they'll take the herbicide right along with it, and it ends up killing the whole plant. And in the springtime, the plants are vigorously growing, they're not moving those carbohydrates into the roots, so again, you just end up with that burn back of a type of an approach. Typically, you want to wait a minimum of about 2 weeks after application of the herbicide, the Roundup herbicide anyway, especially if it's an older pasture or hay meadow where you have a buildup of organic matter, thatch and litter and that type of thing. Roundup binds to the soil particles, mineral particles, but it does not bind to that litter, so it can stay active for a period of time following application. So that's why you want to have this this waiting period in there before you actually come in and reseed. Again, this primarily applies to irrigated conditions. You could possibly use this approach in a dryland pasture situation, but remember that in our dry land, those plants are already typically stressed due to lack of water, and so you add a stress on top of it of a herbicide being applied to it, and you can actually kill more of the plants, and they just don't get the number of plants that survive the herbicide application and come back later. Timing of interseeding. Spring is a good time to do that. Prior to the start of the irrigation season, or prior to the start of those spring rains in a dryland situation, that March through early May time period is a pretty good time to seed or interseed over the top of existing plants. I really like the late summer. If you have irrigation and have irrigation water available, the late summer seeding, follow that seeding up with haying or a heavy grazing, that mid-August time period. Again, this is not going to work under dryland conditions because we typically don't have enough moisture at that point in time to get those plants up and well enough established, because you need about 6 to 8 weeks of growth before that first hard frost in the fall. So water is essential to make this work. For the dryland pastures, this late fall, winter, what we call a dormant season seeding, is typically one of your best times for dryland seedings. Basically any time from about November, early to mid-November, depends on what elevation you're at, through that that early March time period. Anytime the ground is not frozen. Again, this is going to be your best choice for dryland seeding, especially your dryland grass seedings. Basically, you're putting the seed in the ground. It's just overwintering, and you get some winter moisture, some spring moisture, but you'll get that germination in the spring as that soil temperature warms up. So key number 3 here, again, I consider, if possible, the optimum timing, again, if you have irrigation water, is to seed in that mid to late summer following that haying or grazing those established plants. At this point in time, the regrowth on the grasses is primarily vegetative. You don't get that big, tall, stemmy growth, so it's going to reduce any shading effects on those little seedlings. It's going to have just overall reduced need for suppression, reduced competition at that point in time. Interseeded plants are slower to establish compared to conventionally seeded plants, again, when you do that complete tillage. So you want to move up your seeding time just a little bit, about 2 weeks earlier than you would seed, if you're in a complete tillage, complete renovation type of a situation. And this is especially important for legumes. Those legumes just need a little bit longer time period in that fall, late summer, fall time period to establish compared to your grasses. Grasses establish very well with this late summer, early fall seeding. Again, this works very well on your irrigated, not on your dryland sites. There's just an example. This was up in the Hayden area outside of Steamboat, where they took, for that area anyway, a fairly early hay crop in early July. And then we just came in after they took that hay crop off, and we seeded either this Norson bird's foot trefoil or 5 different varieties of alfalfa. No other suppression, no herbicides, no grazing, no mechanical suppression, nothing. We just directly seeded after they took this early hay crop off. And you see the numbers there. These are the numbers of plants we counted per square foot, number of seedlings per square foot. For the alfalfa, it ranged from about 2 to 3 plants per square foot. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot of plants, but again, this is an interseeding. We're just trying to add some new plants to the existing plants. If you think about, an alfalfa plant, and if you can visualize 2 to 3 of those alfalfa plants in a square foot area, that's going to add significantly to our overall forage quality and forage production in that particular meadow. The bird's foot trefoil, again, a very small seed, has kind of a weak seedling vigor. We had about 5.5 plants per square foot. Now, we'll probably lose a few of those over time because the trefoil isn't quite as vigorous as the alfalfa, but these numbers I consider to be successful interseedings when we're trying to get legumes, especially interseeded into our existing grass stands. You don't have to have 20 plants per square foot. Key 4, this one's extremely important when we're talking about interseeding, your fertilizer practices. A lot of people, they understand that plants need nutrients and adding some fertilizer typically increases production and all of that, but in this interseeding, you really want to avoid nitrogen at all costs, and I put a lot of exclamation points after that there. It basically is going to stimulate that existing vegetation, especially the grasses, and basically you'll end up with a seeding that fails because those existing plants just outcompete those little seedlings. So avoid nitrogen at all costs when you're doing interseeding. Phosphorus may be beneficial, especially if it can be banded below the seed. And again, base your phosphorus applications on a good soil test. But when you're thinking about adding some fertilizer back to the system, and it can be manures or commercial fertilizers, doesn't really matter. It's generally best to wait until the seedlings are well established before you add fertilizer back. That's going to be the following year for your grass seedings. You add primarily nitrogen, maybe a little bit of phosphorus depending on your soil test. Fall for legumes. Phosphorus, what those legumes plants need, so the phosphorus isn't as mobile as the nitrogen, so applying it in the fall, make sure it ensures that it's there in the spring when those new legumes start to grow. Again, if you're under dryland conditions, again, really minimize any thoughts of applying fertilizer. Maybe a little bit of phosphorus if the soil test says it needs it, probably little or no nitrogen. Key number 5 is to drill the seed. We'll talk a little bit about broadcasting the seed, but if at all possible, you want to drill the seed because drilling it is almost always more successful than broadcasting, especially when we're talking about interseeding. So I have a number of pictures there that show all different types of drills. There's a large number of them. This is just a small sampling. You want to use a drill that's designed to specifically seed grasses and legumes. It's going to place the seed at the proper depth, and we'll talk about depth here in a little bit, and has press wheels that are going to firm that soil around the seed so you get that good seed to soil contact. But again, those drills sometimes aren't available. There are contractors. Sometimes your local conservation district may have drills that you can rent or lease. So those are options to look at. But a lot of people are kind of relegated to the idea of just broadcasting the seed out there and trying to get it incorporated into the soil as best as they can. So there's a number of different ways to broadcast a seed. Ones that fit on your tractor, on your ATV, on the back of your pickup truck. And if it's a small enough area, you can use just the hand push type of a broadcast spreader. Any of those will work. So here's kind of my tips for trying to improve your success of broadcast seeding in an interseeding type of an approach. Again, suppression of the existing vegetation is really needed. Again, your heavy grazing or overgrazing is a good way to achieve that. Your close mowing, that flail type mower is a good way. You can use the Roundup herbicide if you want to go that way. But suppress it, try to set those plants back any way you can. Then you want to come in, you want to rough up that soil surface a little bit. Again, seed to soil contact is extremely important with any forage seeding. So any type of a harrow, the English type harrow, which I have pictured there, is a good way to do that. Spike type tooth harrow, spring tooth, light disking, anything to just kind of break up that surface soil crust a little bit so you can get that seed kind of mixed in with the soil a little bit. So rough it up, spread the seed, broadcast the seed out there. Then you're going to want to come back over the top of that and then lightly harrow or drag that pasture to, again, to try to cover that seed, get that seed mixed in with the soil a little bit. Again, I really like these English harrows. Most of them have spikes on one side, so it can really rough things up. And then when you spread the seed, you can flip them over and use the smooth side. That's a good way, again, to kind of mix that soil and the seed together. Again, you can also use grazing for a short period of time, typically, less than 7 to 10 days. You don't want, if you get any moisture out there, either through rain or irrigation, you don't want those animals out there when those plants are trying to germinate. They're very vulnerable at that point in time. So graze for a short period of time, let those hooves imprint that seed into the soil, and then get those animals off of there. And if you have water, you want to keep that surface wet for about 6 to 8 weeks with light, frequent irrigation. And you really want to irrigate to enhance those seedlings and not the existing vegetation. I think that's what I'm trying to say here is that management during that establishment year, a lot of people put the seed in the ground and think they can continue to manage those existing plants like they always have, but you really need to alter your management during that year of seeding to favor those new seedlings. There's more to interseeding than just putting the seed in the ground. You can use the best drill in the world, but if you don't have that after management, once that seed's in the ground, you're going to have a failed seeding. So again, irrigate to promote those new seedlings, not the established vegetation, that light, frequent applications for the first 4 to 8 weeks. You actually really want to kind of stress those existing plants a little bit if possible. And the last thing there is to remove the existing vegetation, that overstory, either through haying or light grazing, again, to allow that light back down into the canopy. We don't want to forget about light competition. So this is just an example of a study we did up in again, north of Steamboat, and where we seeded trefoil, red clover, or 3 different varieties of alfalfa. And the 0 weeks, the kind of that pinkish bar there, is we basically kind of simulated a heavy grazing. We just used a mower, but we took off everything down to about 2.5, 3 inches, about 2.5, 3 inches of stubble. So that would have simulated kind of that overgrazing type of a scenario. That's what we were trying to get at. And then everything was seeded at the same time at that point in time. And then on some other plots, we came back in 3 weeks, removed the overstory. Other plots, we came back in 5 weeks, removed the overstory. And then the last one there is 7 weeks, which would have been the normal time in which this particular meadow was hayed. So as you can see there, waiting until that normal haying time on this particular meadow, we had probably about the worst establishment of all of those different species, especially the trefoil and some of the alfalfa varieties. Again, that shading effect can really, those plants get yellow, they don't have sunlight down, they're not stimulating the chlorophyll, they get weak and spindly trying to grow up towards the light, and then once you do remove that overstory, they're exposed to the elements and they just kind of dry up and wither and die. So the trefoil, some of the alfalfa varieties really responded to removing that overstory 2 weeks earlier than you normally would. So just kind of, again, trying to illustrate that change your management a little bit in that year of seeding to favor those new seedlings. Okay, we'll finish up here talking about that complete renovation, reseeding, where you basically you decided you don't like what's out there and you're just going to completely start over. So this is going to generally consist of, plowing the field, disking it multiple times, leveling it if it needs it, especially for irrigation, roller harrow or cultipacket to firm that seed bed up, and maybe some herbicidal weed control, and then you're going to come in and drill the seed back in there. Again, this is a lot more expensive compared to interseeding, at least double the cost and sometimes triple the cost or more compared to the interseeding approach. But again, there's less risk. You're going to be more assured of getting that stand with this complete renovation. So here's just kind of the list. We'll touch on a few of these. Probably won't go into all of these in great detail, but again, weed control, fertility, your seed bed prep, correct time of seeding, those types of things. So the first one, again, first key here is weed control. Again, failure to adequately control your weeds is a major factor that leads to either thin stands or failed seedings, even when you're doing complete tillage, complete renovation. Your perennial forages are slower to establish than most all of your weed species, especially your annual weeds. You're always going to have some annual weeds out there, but you really want to try to minimize that as much as possible. If you have any perennial weeds like Canada thistle, again, leafy spurs, those noxious ones that have those underground rhizomes, sometimes these you really need to be thinking 2 years prior to getting those under control. So when you put those new plants in the ground, they don't have to compete with these established plants that have those really vigorous underground root and rhizome systems. Because if you start out with a thin stand, it's going to require you to reseed it, or it will never really produce at its full potential. So either way, you're going to have kind of an economic loss. So here's an example, personal example of field bindweed. This was over at the research center over by Hotchkiss. I was going to establish some forage plots, had the ground all prepped, had all the rocks picked, and we got a little rain and the field just turned green with field bindweed. Again, this is one of those plants that has that underground rhizome root system, very vigorous. You go in there with a piece of tillage equipment and it just makes the plant mad. You break up all those rhizomes, you just get all of these new plants coming from those buds on those rhizomes. So about the only way to really get this under control is to use some type of a chemical herbicide. I try to minimize herbicide use myself, but a lot of times it's about your only choice for some of these species. Soil fertility, even though you're starting, you don't have those existing plants out there, I still typically recommend that you minimize any application of starter fertilizer, especially starter nitrogen. At most, apply about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre when you're seeding pure grass stands. Basically, the weeds are better competitors typically than your forages, so they're going to use the nitrogen and just become more competitive against those little seedlings that you're trying to get established. And then if you're trying to establish a grass-legume mix, legumes fix their own nitrogen, so you really don't need any additional nitrogen. You'll just stimulate the grass and end up with a grass stand and very little legume if you apply any starter nitrogen when you're seeding a grass-legume mix. Instead, the key is to concentrate on phosphorus. Phosphorus is very important for the establishment of both grasses and legumes. It's very important for good root development. Again, get a soil test, apply it based on your soil test, typically 20 to 80 pounds of phosphorus per acre. It doesn't move very quickly into the soil, so incorporate it if at all possible prior to seeding, and if at all possible, you can band it below the seed. Again, so those roots actually just grow into that, that phosphorus that you've applied as a fertilizer. This is just an example of both alfalfa and brome grass, where they applied no phosphorus, or they applied 60 pounds of phosphorus, and they put it either directly under the seed or at different distances away from the seed. And you can see after only 30 days, the difference in the weight of the individual plants were significantly increased, 3 to 4 times by, again, banding that phosphorus directly below the seed. The further away you moved, the less impact it had because those roots weren't able to access that phosphorus. The problem is there's very few drills or pieces of equipment that will actually band the phosphorus below the seed. You can use a lot of these older conventional grain type drills. A lot of those will have boxes for alfalfa. That little box on the front there is, you can seed alfalfa and some of the smaller clovers and things through it. They'll have a box for fertilizer, and they'll also have a box for your larger seeded grasses. And so you can actually utilize these. These are fairly cheap to purchase. A lot of them will come set up to do this, but if it's not set up, you can actually just add some tubing and drop the fertilizer between the discs in about 2 inches deep. You run a tube to the back and drop those seeds on the surface, and then press those in with the press wheel or packer wheel, again, because you don't want those too deep. And then again, as that seed germinates, it's going to grow right into that phosphorus. A lot more vigorous plant. Seed bed prep is extremely important. Firm seed beds are essential. You've tilled this ground up, plowed it up, disked it up. It's going to be kind of powdery, fluffy. You're going to get the seed planted too deep if you try to seed into that type of a seed bed. The general rule of thumb is that on your surface firmness, when you walk out across the field, you don't want to see your footprint go in any more than about 1/4 of an inch. And typically, the firmer the better. I really like this photo. Shows it's a good example of how important a firm seed bed is. You can actually see the lugs on the tractor tire that ran across the field, and that's about the only place that this forage actually came up, was in the tractor tire, in the lugs where the lugs ran themselves. Again, that nice firm seed bed. Free of large clods. I say why? Again, these seeds, you only want about 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep at most. So if you have a lot of clods out there, it's hard to get that seed placed at that proper depth. I also say there are some small clods can be good. Why? The reason is especially in our heavier clay soils that tend to want to crust once they get wet, the small clods actually provide that clay soil, as they dry, that soil dries, will kind of pull away from those small clods, provides these cracks where those little seedlings can actually come up through those cracks. And a lot of times that's the only place you'll actually get new plants established, is in the cracks on these heavier clay soils. So how do you get those nice firm seed beds? This is what I consider to be a must-have piece of equipment. Lots of different names of these: cultipackers, Rolaharas, but they kind of break up the clods, firm up the soil, get rid of a lot of those really big clods. It's just a good way to get that firm seed bed about, when your foot doesn't go in any more than about 1/4 of an inch. So here's some examples. The photo there in kind of that lower left shows a footprint. You can barely see the footprint there. Again, this is a nice, fine, firm seed bed. It's ready to be seeded. Again, those 2 photos there on the left, I really like those. These are on a little bit heavier clay soils. Again, you can kind of see that nice, fine or smaller clods. Again, that will help to keep that soil from becoming too crusty. The one on the right there is nice and firm, but it's also pretty fine. So if that's a heavier clay soil, you're going to get a lot of crusting, and those little seedlings just won't be able to make it through that crust. Proper seeding depth. Again, we're dealing with these small seeds. They don't have a lot of stored energy, so seeding too deep is one of the leading causes of poor establishment. So the smaller the seed and the heavier the texture, the more clay in the soil, the shallower you need to seed. So for a small seeded forage on a fine textured clay type soil, again, no more than 1/2 of an inch. So that's kind of the general recommendation for most of our forages. Unless you're on, again, more of a sandy type soil, you can actually seed those a little bit deeper, and those plants will be able to come up and access that moisture in those sandy soils. But if you're drilling and you're trying to drill at that 1/4 to 1/2 an inch deep, you actually should be able to find a few seeds laying on the surface, about 8 to 10 seeds per square foot. So you're not going to actually get all seeds, even using a drill. You're not going to get all of those completely covered up with soil. Time of seeding, again, very similar to the interseeding approach. You can seed in the spring. I really like this late summer. Again, if you have irrigation water, this late August, early September time period, if at all feasible. Temperatures they're warm, the soil is warm. You're going to get rapid germination, rapid emergence, rapid establishment. The weed pressures are lighter. Your annual weeds have kind of gone through their growth cycle, and you're not going to have the annual weed pressure. Again, you need to make sure you have about 6 to 8 weeks before that first hard freeze to get those plants up. Excellent way for grass establishment. Legumes, again, you need to seed those just a little bit earlier, a week or 2 earlier than you would seed those grasses. The picture there in the lower right is where we seeded in the first week of September out at the research farm. Got an excellent stand of grasses. We actually had some legumes mixed in with the grasses, and we didn't get any legumes because they just didn't get up enough and well enough established to survive the winter, and they winter killed on us. Dormant season seedings, again, ideal if you're working under dryland pastures, generally after mid-November. You want the soil temperatures to be cold enough that you don't get germination. One of the drawbacks, if you completely tilled it up, you've exposed the soil to, especially wind erosion. So seeding into some type of a grain stubble or sorghum stubble that you planted earlier in the summer is a good way to avoid that erosion potential. But you put the seed in the ground, it's there in the spring when it, get the spring rains, the spring snows, those types of things. Disadvantages that, you can get some germination maybe too early, get those really early springs, warm winters, you can get some germination too early, and those little seedlings can be killed by frost. Again, this works very well for our dryland grass seedings, whether it's interseeding or whether it's a complete tillage, complete renovation. Key 6 there, companion crops. You want to use those wisely. These are just basically annual crops like oats or something that you seed with your perennials. They're not always needed. They can actually compete just like a weed would with those little forages, perennial forages that are coming up. But they do provide some quick ground cover, reduce your soil erosion, helps with some weed control, prevents wind damage, and probably the time that I really like to use the companion crops, the annual companion crops, is to reduce soil crusting on the heavier clay soils. So select your proper crop. I really like oats. That's probably the most common. You can use spring wheat, triticale, those types, but avoid your winter annuals. Avoid the winter wheat, the winter triticale, those types. They just compete too strongly with the little forages. Reduce your planting rate. At least 30 to 50% of normal. I found that about 15 pounds of oats, when you're planting alfalfa in some of these forages, really reduces your weeds, provides some of those other benefits, but allows those little forages to get established. And that's what you see there in the photo. And the last thing there is to remove that companion crop early, typically at that late boot to early heading stage. That's probably one of the where people fail, is they don't remove that companion crop early enough. So as an alternative to a live companion crop, again, you can use or no-till seed into some type of a stubble. Typically like a sorghum Sudan grass works very well, or Sudan grass. You plant that earlier in the summer. You take that off as a hay crop. You leave about 5 to 6 inches of stubble, and then you come in and you no-till seed your forages into those in that either late summer or dormant seeding in that November winter time period. Works very well, and it doesn't compete. You got a lot, catches snow over the winter. A lot of different advantages to using this seeding into these different types of stubbles. But again, it's going to require some type of a drill, one of those heavier type drills, no-till type drills to do this. Seed to soil contact. Anytime we talk about forages, we have to talk about seed to soil contact. Again, they're small. We don't want them too deep. We have to have some soil coverage to get good germination, good establishment. So again, a number of different types of drills to do that. Again, use one that has some kind of a depth band or depth control on it, so it seeds at the proper depth, and again has that press wheel, packing wheel on the back to firm that soil up around the seed. Some other options, again, to get that seed to soil contact, you can use a lot of those grain type, conventional type drills, and you can provide, either a packer wheel, you can pull behind it, you can just use some type of a wire mesh drag, a piece of a chain harrow. Some people use drag chains, just kind of these little round loops, and it drags behind the drill. Again, just mixes that seed up with the soil a little bit to get, again, that good seed to soil contact. Agitators, again, essential if you're using a drill. A lot of these forages, especially your warm season forages, and even some of your cool season forages like your bromes, smooth and meadow brome, Garrison creeping meadow foxtail, they have little hairs on the seed, and they'll just bridge up in the drill, and they won't flow and they won't meter out correctly. So different things you can do. Again, use agitators, a drill with an agitator to keep that seed stirred up and keep it flowing. You can add things like rice hulls to help the seed to flow. Some of the seed they actually coat. The Garrison creeping meadow foxtail down there in the corner has, again, you see that nice hairy seed, but they can actually coat that with a clay coating. Again, helps it to flow through the drill and meter out correctly. Broadcast seeding, you can, prepare the seed bed. Again, nice, smooth, firm seed bed, really important. And you can Broadcast the seed out there. Works very well with alfalfa and some of the other small seeded forages. It's sometimes difficult to really get good adequate soil coverage or and that seed to soil contact with your larger seeded species like your bromes and some of your wheatgrasses. Again, this is where your cultipacker really comes in. It's a lot better, broadcast the seed out there and then run that cultipacker over. It's going to imprint that seed down into the soil, get really good seed to soil contact. When we're broadcast seeding, I would typically recommend that you double the seeding rate over what is recommended for drilling. So again, there's going to be a little bit of an added cost in your seed there. One caution if you are broadcast seeding is don't mix species that have the small, round, hard seeds like your alfalfas and clovers with some of those larger, fluffy seeds like I believe meadow brome there. It's kind of large, flat seed. It's going to result in uneven distribution behind the broadcaster. It's going to throw those little round, hard seeds in a wider swath than it will throw those big, flat brome seeds. So you end up with a field that have a good mix of brome and legume, and then all legume, and then it's just kind of a funny looking field if you see one like that. Just finish up here with some irrigation management. Again, if you're irrigated situation, it's really critical that first 4 to 8 weeks to really use light, frequent applications of water. If at all possible, keep that surface wet until you see the emergence. It's amazing. Even though these seeds are small and don't have a lot of energy, they can come up from half to an inch deep if that surface or that soil is moist. It's difficult to do out in a field situation, but if you have a sprinkler irrigation system and you can run that and keep that surface moist until that those plants break the surface, they can come up from a fairly deep depth. But again, you get that crust on there, that's when you have the problems, and that's what we're showing here. In the photos, they're coming up in the cracks, but you have those plants that are just kind of curling over underneath that crust. So again, good irrigation management, especially on our heavier clay soils, we can alleviate a lot of those failed seedings by keeping that surface wet. Just a few other management considerations. Again, weed control, you're always going to have some annual weeds. Mowing is an excellent option. Again, mow at a fairly high height, about 4 to 6 inches. You can use appropriate herbicides on some of these, but again, the mowing works very well, especially on some of your smaller acreages. You don't want to graze those seedlings until they're well established. You want that root system to be sufficiently developed. And the way to test that is just go out there and grab a handful of those new plants, and if you can pull them up by their roots, then they're not ready to be grazed. So for your irrigated seedings, especially your spring seedings, it's best to wait until late summer or fall. Again, let those root systems develop. For dryland seedings, typically we don't want to graze those for at least the first year and preferably 2 years. Again, that's going to all depend on Mother Nature and how much rain you get and how quickly those plants establish. But again, you really want to be careful in those dryland seedings to let those plants and those root systems develop sufficiently before you graze them. And again, a good recommendation is not to graze those in that 6-week time period before that first killing frost. You really want to let those plants, again, those root systems develop and to store those carbohydrates so they're able to overwinter. So last photo here is just regardless of the method you use to put the seed in the ground, you're always going to need a little bit of luck especially from Mother Nature to get those new plants established and up. So with that, I'm finished and have a few minutes here for questions.
One at a time. So the first one, John asks, can you discuss the advantages of dragging a harrow on the pasture?
So I assume that this is just kind of like the annual dragging of the pasture. One of the main reasons to do that is to spread the manure, break up the manure, break it into smaller particle sizes so you get faster decomposition, faster mineralization of that the nutrients in that organic matter. So that's one of the biggest reasons for dragging or harrying a pasture periodically. In the springtime, it will also remove some of that litter, and so you get a faster soil warming, and you can sometimes get a faster spring growth by kind of removing or dragging, harrowing some of that litter off of the pasture. So.
Okay. Chris asks, what time of year do you recommend overseeding, and would you keep animals from grazing that area for a period of time? I guess you kind of answered that already.
Yeah, the overseeding, there's different, you can do what they call frost seeding. that you can do that during the winter time period. Early spring time period is a common way to overseed, especially some of the like clovers and different types of legumes. You can do that. Yeah, any of these seeding methods, once those new plants start to come up and germinate, for a period of time, again, until they're fairly well established, you want to minimize your grazing. Now, the reason to maybe graze is to remove that overstory, so again, you don't get that light competition. So again, lightly graze the existing plants that are there that you've overseeded over the top of, but don't leave the animals in there so long that they're actually grazing and doing a lot of trampling damage to those overseeded plants.
Okay. Next one is from Ron. He asks if you recommend burning pastures in the early spring and what is the benefit of burning?
In our area, I typically don't recommend the burning of pastures. We typically don't have enough production. The big reason to burn pastures is to get rid of the litter, accumulation of litter. So in higher rainfall areas where get into eastern Kansas and places where you have a lot of litter accumulation, burning is will get rid of that litter, speed up the spring growth again, recycle those nutrients, those types of things. But out in the Colorado and a lot of our area, I don't typically recommend the burning. So.
Okay. Chris asks, do you recommend interseeding and weed management at the same time or in a different order?
As far as weed management, it's always best to do your weed management prior to seeding, if at all possible. Again, especially if you're dealing with any kind of perennial noxious weeds, your thistles, your spurge, those types. Anything you're going to have to use a herbicide on, it's best to do that prior. With interseeding, you're typically not going to have, unless you have those perennial noxious weeds, you're typically not going to have a lot of weed issues like you would with the annual weeds in your complete tillage, complete renovation situation.
Next one is from Chris. If you're in a high mountain meadow situation over 65,000 feet, are there seeds that do better than others?
Yeah, there's always going to be species that do better in your higher elevation. Just depends on, again, what you're looking for. But Timothy does well up in the high elevation. There's one called your Garrison creeping meadow foxtail does well in those high elevation mountain hay meadows. Smooth brome does fairly well. Orchard grass a lot of times will tend to winter kill unless you have a snow cover. Clovers, your red and Alsite clover work really well as far as a legume for those high elevation meadows. Those are some of the ones that kind of come to mind right here off the top of my head.
And actually, Joe did a webinar for us last year. I think it's called Common Forage Grasses for Colorado. And so that's another great webinar to check out. It's on our archived webinar page, and I'll send everyone the link to that as well. And so that he talks about a whole bunch of different forages and where they're appropriate. And also you can contact your local NRCS office. They're a great source of information to help you with choosing seeds and reseeding and looking at your different soil types and the appropriate seeds for the soils. Let's see, Rocky Mountain BioAg asks, you discussed adding NP and K fertilizer. Would you suggest adding micronutrients to add nutrition back to the forage?
Typically, N and P are the ones that we're most concerned about here in Colorado. The micronutrients, hasn't been a lot of evidence or a lot of research anyway even done to look at the importance of some of those. I mean, there's been a little bit of work with sulfur and boron and a few of those, especially in alfalfa production. They might be needed, but get a soil test. I guess I'm not don't think on a big scale general recommendation that I would recommend a lot of micronutrients unless in certain situations where we might typically specifically identified a nutrient deficiency.
Okay. Deb Lester is at 10,000 feet, and she's asking, I think, what time to seed. She's asking if during a short growing season, if late summer would work for seeding. I think that's what you're asking, Deb.
Yeah, not at 10,000 feet. That's going to be, you can either do a dormant season seeding at that elevation so the seeds are in the ground and ready to come up when that soil warms up enough in the spring to stimulate growth. Or at that elevation, I would do an early spring seeding, again, just get the seeds in the ground, just due to the short growing season at that elevation. So you want to give those plants plenty of time, or as much time as possible, to get that root system down and developed, get that crown developed so they can overwinter.
Chris Page asks, do you have a suggestion for seeding on fairly steep slopes?
Not sure exactly.
Maybe for erosion control concerns? Probably no-till. He talked on that really briefly about using a cover crop like a sorghum Sudan and then cutting it and using a no-till drill.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how steep the slope is, and I mean, you can use the broadcasting. You can broadcast the seeds on slopes that way. There's hydro seeders you can use on fairly steep slopes to, get the seed to stick up there and get that seed to soil contact. I'm not quite exactly sure what all you're asking with that question.
Maybe you can type some more if you're concerned more about erosion or just that it's so steep that, I don't know, you won't be able to put any equipment on it.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead with the next question. Ron asks, is a phosphorus test of 15 okay? What rate per acre is advisable to use if phosphorus is needed?
Phosphorus is one of those you have to actually know what test was run, because different tests extract different levels of phosphorus. But for the tests, like either test that is normally run in Colorado, that should be an adequate phosphorus level. So you probably wouldn't need to add any at that availability at this point in time anyway.
And usually they say on your soil test.
Yeah, the soil test will that generally say, yeah.
They'll give you recommendations.
Whether phosphorus is needed or recommended for that particular soil.
JW asks, are there any natural fertilizers you recommend to increase soil nitrogen level? Also, are there other ways of reducing or eliminating weeds without using herbicides? So kind of an organic approach, sounds like, to establishing grass.
Natural fertilizers. Again, if you're talking about compost and manures, yeah, definitely you can utilize those. Sometimes with manures, you want to the composts are maybe a little better than some of the manures, because the composting will a lot of times get rid of at least some of the potential for weed seed contamination when you're reseeding. Manures a lot of times will have weeds or different things in them that will compete with the forages you're trying to get established. I haven't worked a lot with a lot of the natural organic type of nitrogen products out there, so I can't really answer that question. As far as weed control, again, mowing is a good way to reduce weeds. Again, if you get those perennial noxious ones, competition is probably if you're dealing with an organic and natural type situation, you don't want to use the chemicals. Competition, getting those competitive forages established, and there are ones that tend to be more competitive than some of the others. Things like pubescent wheatgrass, and some of those are really competitive against things like leafy spurge and Canada thistle. So competition is probably the best way, and then using mowing to keep things from going to seed be some of your better recommendations there, I think.
And Joe, I'll just say a quick thing on organic fertilizers. Because they're so expensive, all the organic farmers that I know anyway just generally use compost or manure, because on a large scale it's just not financially feasible. All right, next question from Chris. What are good resources for getting soil tests? And I think actually someone answered that below. She gave the soil testing lab at CSU. That's usually the one I recommend, or if there are lots of local soil testing labs, right?
There's a number of different private labs, Weld labs, and some in Nebraska, different places. Any of those labs will give you a good test.
What is the best technique to try to get rid of and replace cheatgrass? Ooh, cheatgrass. We all hate it.
Oh, that's a tough one. Because you're going to have, no matter what you do, you're still going to have a seed bank of cheatgrass seeds in the soil. Again, try to do the best you can up front, whether you're using tillage or chemical means of getting the cheatgrass under control, and then again, seed it, get those new plants up, and get that competition. Competition is going to be in the long run, is going to be your best bet to fight against cheatgrass.
And if you email me, Roger, I can send, or who was that asked that? Roger, you just send me an email and I can send you some more specific information on cheatgrass control. Let's see, Mike. Chris, try talking to your conservation district, okay? Or talk to your conservation district. Let's see. Oh, then we have the link to the CSU Soil Testing Lab. Thank you for that. Rocky Mountain BioAg, what would you suggest to do on heavy alkaline clay soils with very high salt content? Tough conditions.
Yeah, they're tough conditions. The big thing is you have to pick the species that are adapted. Get your soil test, know what your actual salt content is. Tall wheatgrass, new high hybrid wheatgrass, some of those that have, some of your wheatgrasses have that really, your better salt content, better adaptation to those types of soils would be your best bet for seeding. So other than that, there's not a whole lot you can do to remediate a lot of those types of soils.
Ted asks, what are your thoughts on air seeders?
I really haven't dealt with air seeders much. Yeah, anything that puts a seed in the ground and puts it at the proper depth and gets that good seed to soil contact, yeah, if you have access to an air seeder, it should work just fine. So.
Thanks, John. He's put the name of our last webinar that Joe did for us last year, Common Forage Grasses, so check that out on our website. The next one, Rob, what is the latest thoughts on seed inoculants?
What inoculants? I mean, we always want to inoculate our legume seeds with the proper rhizobium bacteria so we get the nitrogen fixation. I assume maybe you're talking about some of the seed inoculants for some of the grasses and those types of things. I haven't really dealt with those too much. I haven't really done any research on those, and again, probably not really a good one to answer, or not in the situation to really answer that question at this point in time, because I really haven't dealt with them or read up much on those. So.
Chris is adding to her, so she was talking about what's good on a steep slope. So she's saying that it's steep, so steep that no equipment can be on it. Partially for erosion control and partially for grazing llamas who don't mind the steep slopes. So you're trying to reseed it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so you just, again, a broadcast the seed, do the best you can. I'm not sure how big of an area you're talking, but if you can get any kind of mixing of the seed with the soil, raking it, hand raking it, whatever would help. Again, there are people that commercially do again the hydro seeding, and that's always a good way to seed a lot of these steeper type slopes, because it sticks the seed to the soil and gets that seed to soil contact, so you actually get germination and root establishment.
And also too, Joe didn't talk anything about mulching, but you can use weed-free, some sort of straw over the seeding, and that mulching will help hold the seed to the ground if there is some sort of water erosion situation or heavy rain that might pull the seed away otherwise. Let's see, Chris asked what would be a good legume that matures the same time as grass hay to interseed into strips of clover at high elevation irrigated pasture. The primary goal is to benefit elk and sage grouse.
Clover is the legume I would recommend. I mean, either at high elevation, either red clover or Alsite clover are the two that do really well at the high elevation, and they'll draw in both elk and sage grouse. Sage grouse, I was involved in a big project in Gunnison where we seeded hundreds of acres of red and Alsite clover to benefit sage grouse on the edges of those irrigated hay meadows. So.
Okay. Next one, Ron Cooper asks, how do you get rid of foxtail in grass pastures?
When you figure that out, you can tell me. That's a tough one. Again, foxtail, I'm assuming you're talking the foxtail barley. Again, getting good competitive species of grasses in there is probably your best bet. Depends on how big of an area you're talking about, but again, using Roundup, you can wipe it on or just spot spray it and get rid of the, kill the foxtail, and then come back again and overseed, interseed into those areas again to get some good competitive grasses in there that will hopefully keep the foxtail at bay. So we just don't really have much besides Roundup as far as herbicide option, especially when you're talking a grass that's growing in a grass pasture. So that's a very difficult one to deal with, and there's no easy solution to that. So.
Okay. Back to Rob's question, he was talking about grass inoculants, not legume.
Yeah, I'm not going to even try to answer that one. I just don't have enough experience or expertise in dealing with those grass inoculants at this point. So.
Okay, I think that is all the questions. If you have any more questions or follow-up comments, you can feel free to email me, and if I don't know it, I'll forward it on to Joe. So thanks for listening to our webinar today, and catch our next one. I think it's in the next couple weeks. It's November 29th on pasture management for small acreages. Thanks, and have a good day.